So today we're continuing the theme of the quality of life. And just remember back that we started off with naming 5 words that describe your life right now, but also 5 words that you can track your spiritual journey. Then the Sunday after that, we talked about the quality of life of being connected and being in community, because at times we are disconnected. And then we heard about the story of Zacchaeus and how he became connected to God and vice versa. So today we're looking at the story of the 10 lepers in Luke 19. They connect with Jesus, they discover Jesus and vice versa. Because Jesus just so happened to be on the road to Jerusalem, and he is between Samaria and Galilee. Now, just a little bit of information about Samaria. In the Old Testament times, Samaria used to be the capital of the northern part of Israel, which rivaled Jerusalem. So Jerusalem and the temple was in the south, and Samaria was in the north. And Samaria was mountainous, and Jerusalem was flat. And where this city was that Jesus was passing through was kind of in between, but the territories, they were rivaling each other. Because one believed that God is in the mountains, the Samaritans, and the others believed that no, God was in the temple in Jerusalem. The origin of the mountain belief was, of course, back to the story of Moses, where Moses had encountered God. And so the Samaritans set up Mount Gerizim as their religious center with their own brand of Judaism and their own priests and their own practices and leadership and in their own holy writings, and established their own traditions. So they were different. And they had a dislike for each other because they were rivals. So it was the Hebrew centralized people of the temple versus the mountain people. Maybe that's where we get that term, mountain people. So the 10 lepers are not in the city, nor are they in the mountains. And they're in some village, and the village is in between the 2 locations. So what do we know about these 10 lepers? Well, we don't know much, right? We don't know their ages. We don't know when they got the disease. All we know is that they are ostracized, and they are isolated, and they are banished. We don't know their past, but we know that they are labeled. And in that time, leprosy was considered a punishment for either the sin that they committed, or maybe it was a carryover from the sin of their ancestors or relatives. So we don't know anything about that. We don't even know their names. But they're together, and they find commonality and support each other. Now, the great and beautiful thing is they don't have to stay in this condition and situation forever. And as they discover Jesus, then they call out to him, and Jesus responds, and Jesus says, well, go and show yourself to the priest. Now, in the Jewish law and tradition, if someone is healed of leprosy, they needed an official confirmation from the priest. Because as long as they're in that state, no one can interact with them, or of course you couldn't touch them. And if you did touch them, even by accident, you had to go through all these purification rituals in order for you to be not unclean. Because if you touch them, then you're unclean as well. So these lepers then are considered subhuman, and they are avoided at all costs. And so they have to go through the priest to re-enter society. And the priest has a power to restore them and to declare that they are free from this ban. In other words, the priests give them the stamp of approval that the person, okay, is normal and acceptable and no longer bound by this disease. But until then, they are imprisoned in their bodies and in their illness. If you go back to Leviticus, there's all these procedures and rituals that they have to go through, a whole code of conduct. And when I did go back and look at Leviticus 13, there's like 59 different verses that spell out what has to be done. So Jesus then observes protocol and he says to them, go to the priest. In other words, Jesus is saying, you're going to get your life back. Or in other words, what Jesus is saying is there is hope for you, where before they may not have had hope. And sometimes all that we need is to be told there is hope. There is a chance. Just hang on to that hope. And so he says, go. And then the scripture says in verse 14, as they were going, as they were on their way, they became clean. Now the Greek word for clean is diakatharizo. And the root word for that Greek word is catharsis. So a more accurate interpretation is that they were cured. Now that Greek word is used in Matthew chapter 3, verse 12, where Jesus is talking about cleaning the threshing floor where the chaff and the wheat are separated and then the chaff is burned up. Right? So the wheat is put into the barn and the chaff or extra weeds or trash is separated, collected, and burned. So the catharsis then is a separating out and cleaning out, being burned up and eliminating, and whatever that is no more. You are purified. Your affliction has been eradicated and it is gone. So the end result is they must have felt better on the way and stronger and feeling recovery and normalcy. So the stages then is that they encounter Jesus, they're in his presence, and then they discover God's power as they are making their way on the journey, and they feel curing. But it's an internal kind of feeling. Perhaps it's a psychological kind of cleansing because they all of a sudden feel hope. And so when you feel hope in your mind, it's a flip of the switch psychologically. And then in verse 15, then they see with their own eyes that there is a difference. So internally they feel better and cleansed, but they start to see that on the outside their skin with all the sores has disappeared. All the boils, all the swelling or scabs, and the discoloration. And again, Leviticus 13 talks about all of that. But then they discover and they see that they are better. And it's an external kind of healing. Their catharsis is the internal, whereas a different word that was used in that verse 15 was iaomai, which means the external. So there's the internal and the external. So after that, one of them decides in verse 18 to go back to Jesus and to give back to God. And he makes an offering to God, which is simply an expression of thanksgiving or an expression of praise and glorifying God. And that was a gift to God. He could return thanks as an act of worship, for he does have something to offer, which is praise. So finally Jesus says, get up, go on your way, your faith has made you well. And again, that's a different kind of word, Greek word that is used, that he is made well by his faith. So there's curing and healing and then made well. There is catharsis, yaomai, and then sozo is the Greek word. You are made well. And sozo, I have mentioned that before. It has to do with finding one's purpose, finding one's salvation, finding one's destiny. It's a saving, a rescuing of a soul from danger or judgment. And so this one leper out of all the 10 has a complete healing, and he is recognized, he is valued for his worth. The other 9, we don't know what happened to them. They don't offer praises. They don't give thanks to Jesus. So we are probably thinking that their healing must be sort of partial and not altogether complete. Sometimes we don't know about our healing. Sometimes we go through catharsis. Sometimes we go through iaomai. Sometimes we feel the complete salvation in our healing. And the sequence and the timing can be different, but ultimately it is to be well thoroughly. A while back I read this book called The One Life After We've Given, or The One Life We're Given. It's by Mark Nepo. So Mark Nepo had cancer. He had this form of lymphoma, and he had this tumor in his skull. So he had to go through all these tests and all these biopsies. And in the process of doing that, suddenly it disappeared miraculously. But then 10 months later, the tumor came back. But it didn't show up in his head, it was in his rib. And he got afraid, and he feared, and he felt like he had wasted that miracle. He had not honored that initial miracle. Now, he said, honoring means to keep that which is true in view, but to be thankful for what we learned from that miracle and what we learned about ourselves and each other and about life. I think I shared this story before in a previous sermon, but in 2017, I came back from this bike tour, and I had done a week's bike tour, and I was seeing blood in my stool. And then I had all these tests, and it was determined that I had a mass in my colon. And then they discovered that there were islands of cancer in the cells of that mass. And all of a sudden, all these thoughts ran through my head. And I thought, my career's over. And this was 2017. And I had been in ministry for 30 years. And I said, I had a pretty good career. I can give thanks for those years. But then I thought, wait a minute, not only is my career over, my life might be over. I may be relegated to months and months of chemo and radiation and pain and suffering and surgeries. I had 3 surgeries. But then I thought, I just have to accept it, and one day at a time. But the church I was serving rallied around me, and they took me to my surgeries. And so my surgeries was at Southern California Hospital, and Santa Maria, if you know where that is, it's like 2 hours and 15 minutes away from where we live. So they took me to all my 3 surgeries. They prayed for me, and somehow in that process, Marlou fell from the attic and shattered her heel. So they prayed for me, they prayed for her, they had preachers fill in, and then I had the surgeries, and I wore a bag for a while. And I thought, am I going to have to wear this the rest of my life? But then it was a miracle. And I didn't have to have cancer treatments after that. I didn't have to have radiation. I didn't have to have chemotherapy. And the rest of my time is spent honoring the miracle, giving thanks, praising God, like the leper, finding well-being, continuing to live and to serve the church. So I ask you, if you have experienced a miracle, or you're waiting for a miracle, you're trying to overcome and be victorious, how do you honor the miracle, or how do you honor the journey with second chances that God is giving? I leave you to answer that for yourself, but it definitely means a life of praise, a life of thanksgiving, a life of service and witness. And so I leave those thoughts for you to ponder about, how can I honor the miracle that God has given me? To be thankful and to continue to learn. Let us pray.